The bell above the cafe door didn't chime. It seemed to whimper as 3 men in charcoal suits stepped into the dim light of the closing shift. I stood frozen behind the counter, a half-rinsed mug in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I started to offer a shaky apology for being closed, my voice small and practiced in its submissiveness. But the words died in my throat as the men parted. Kang Junseo entered with a silence that was louder than any shout. He was cold precision wrapped in luxury, his black wool coat damp from the sole drizzle, his eyes dark and unsettlingly patient as they swept over the cracked tiles of my mundane world. He didn't look like a debt collector. He looked like an owner. My father was shoved forward from the shadows behind him, looking gray and diminished. He wouldn't meet my eyes, his hands trembling as he gestured vaguely toward me. Junseo didn't look at the debt papers my father clutched. He kept his gaze fixed on me, with a calculating intensity that made my skin prickle. "It's done," my father whispered, the betrayal hanging in the air like thick smoke. He had sold me to settle a debt I hadn't even known existed. Junseo stepped closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain blooming in the small space. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a physical weight, a velvet mask over a steel grip. He gestured toward the door with a slight tilt of his head, an unspoken command that brooked no refusal. With a terrifying, silent efficiency, I was guided out of the cafe and into the back of a black sedan that smelled of leather and finality. The drive through the city was a blur of neon lights and static, the world I knew dissolving behind tinted glass. We ascended in a private elevator that moved so fast my stomach dropped, eventually opening into a high-rise penthouse that felt more like a fortress than a home. The view of Seoul from the floor-to-ceiling windows was staggering, a glittering carpet of millions of lives, all of them suddenly feeling light years away. It was beautiful, but it was terrifying. I stood in the center of the vast, marble-floored living room, my worn sneakers looking like a stain on the perfection of his world. Junseo stood by the glass, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He watched me through the reflection, his expression unreadable, waiting for me to realize that the life I was mourning was already gone. I didn't know how to stand in a room this expensive. The silence of the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city far below. Junseo shed his overcoat, revealing the sharp, impeccable lines of a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light. He moved to a low-slung Italian leather sofa and sat, gesturing for me to take the chair opposite him. I obeyed, my hands knotted in my lap, feeling the grit of the cafe floor still clinging to my skin. "Your father is a man of many appetites and very little foresight," Junseo said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the chill of the underground. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was reading a ledger. He explained the debt, not as a tragedy, but as a transaction. The numbers were astronomical, figures that would have taken me 10 lifetimes to earn at the cafe. He offered many things to settle the balance, Junseo continued, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto mine. I told him I only wanted the collateral he'd been hiding in that apartment for 19 years. The word collateral stung like a physical blow. I was a debt to be collected, a piece of property moved across a board. I asked, my voice cracking, if I was to be a prisoner. A shadow of a smile touched his unreadable face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You are my guest, Emily. You will have the finest clothes, the best food, and every comfort this city can provide. He leaned forward, the smell of sandalwood and rain returning to haunt my senses. But you will never be alone. When you walk, you will have a shadow. When you sleep, a guard will be at your door. You are the most valuable thing I own, and I do not lose what is mine. He was describing an invisible cage, a world where the bars were made of silk, and the locks were made of men in suits. I looked at the floor, my habit of apologizing rising to my throat, but the sheer weight of his gaze stopped me. He wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for submission. "The contract is signed," he stated, standing up with a fluid, predatory grace. "You don't need to worry about the rent, or the debt, or your father ever again. Your only responsibility now is to me." As he walked away, leaving me in the center of that shimmering, terrifying luxury, I realized the cage hadn't just closed. It had been built around me for a very long time. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse, but it brought no warmth to the hollow ache in my chest. Left alone in a suite that felt larger than my entire apartment, I began to move through the rooms, my fingers trailing over surfaces that felt like a dream. But as I opened the doors to the expansive walk-in closet, the dream curdled into something far more unsettling. Row after row of silk dresses, tailored trousers, and soft cashmere sweaters hung in perfect silence. I reached for a simple cream blouse, bracing myself for it to be too long or too tight. But as I held it against me, I realized the cut was exact. Every shoe, every hem, and every waistline was a hauntingly perfect fit. It wasn't just a guess. It was data. My breathing hitched as I moved to the bathroom, finding the vanity stocked with the specific, obscure brand of jasmine tea tree soap I had once mentioned in a passing conversation at the cafe 3 years ago. A brand that had been discontinued for months. I retreated to the small library nook, hoping for the comfort of a stranger's books, only to find the shelves lined with the very titles I had kept on a secret wish list in a tattered notebook I carried in my apron. There were first editions of poetry I had only ever looked at through shop windows, their spines uncreased, waiting for me. A cold shiver raced up my spine as the pieces of my life began to click into a terrifying new pattern. I remembered the lucky scholarship that had covered my second semester when I was about to drop out. I remembered the landlord who had suddenly decided not to hike the rent when every other unit in the building went up. I had called it Providence. I had thanked the universe for the crumbs of mercy that kept me from drowning. Now, standing in the heart of Junseo's fortress, I realized there was no universe, no luck, and no mercy. There was only him. Every miracle that had saved me over the last 4 years hadn't been an act of God. It had been an investment by the man in the black suit. He hadn't just bought me last night. He had been curated me, shaped the world around me, to ensure I remained exactly where he wanted me. The realization was a heavy, suffocating weight. I wasn't a girl who had been rescued from a storm. I was a bird that had been raised in a cage I didn't even know existed until he finally decided to shut the door. The following week, the invisible cage expanded to include the dark, glass-walled corridors of the Kang Syndicate's headquarters. Junseo did not ask if I was ready. He simply arrived at my door with a dress of midnight silk and a look that signaled the end of my isolation. He led me to a boardroom that smelled of expensive leather and cold adrenaline, forcing me to sit in a velvet chair directly at his right hand. I kept my eyes lowered, a familiar armor of invisibility, but the heavy silence of the room told me that every man at the table was staring at the girl who had suddenly appeared at the boss's side. The meeting was a masterclass in cold precision. Junseo spoke in a low, measured tone that never rose, yet seemed to drain the air from the room. The discussion turned to a shipment that had been intercepted, a mistake made by a man named Han, who had once been a frequent, leering regular at my cafe. As Junseo leaned forward, the light caught the sharp, unreadable lines of his face. He didn't shout or show anger. He simply recounted Han's history of failures with the clinical detachment of a man performing surgery. "You were bold when you followed her home last winter, Han," Junseo said, his voice dropping an octave. The room went deathly still. "You thought the shadows protected you from my sight." I felt a jolt of pure terror. I remembered that night, the heavy footsteps behind me, the cold sweat on my neck. I had thought I'd just been lucky to find an open convenience store to duck into. Looking at Junseo now, I realized my luck had likely been a black sedan idling at the end of the block. With a flick of his wrist, Junseo signaled his men. The violence that followed was swift and silent, a brutal reminder of the world I now inhabited. As Han was dragged from the room, Junseo reached out, his hand covering mine on the table. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to the icy atmosphere he had just created. In that moment, the invisible cage felt less like a prison and more like a fortress. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the truth in his dark, calculating eyes. He was a monster, a man who moved people like chess pieces and erased them without hesitation. But as his thumb traced a slow, possessive circle over my knuckles, I realized that his terrifying obsession was the only thing standing between me and the jagged, violent edges of the underground. I was his collateral, his prize, and his most dangerous secret. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was protected. The meeting was arranged in a secluded, wood-paneled parlor within the estate, a room that felt too small for the weight of the ghosts I was carrying. Junseo stood by the hearth, a silent sentinel in the shadows, his presence a dark anchor as my father was led in. My father looked worse than he had at the cafe. His eyes were sunken, darting nervously toward the luxury surrounding us, smelling of stale sweat and desperation. For a fleeting heartbeat, my heart ached for him. I wanted to believe he was here to beg for my freedom, to offer his own life in exchange for the daughter he had signed away. "Emily," he croaked, stepping toward me with outstretched hands. I flinched, and from the corner of my eye, I saw Junseo's jaw tighten, his posture shifting into a predatory stillness. My father didn't notice. He began to ramble about the misunderstanding and the unfairness of the debt. But as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to the jade sculpture on the side table, the silk of my dress, the sheer wealth of my cage. Then, the mask slipped. He didn't ask if I was hurt. He didn't ask if I was afraid. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He likes you, Emily. I can see it. If you just ask him for a little more, a gesture of goodwill for your old man, I could get back on my feet. I could settle the other accounts." The world went cold. He wasn't here to save me. He was here to use his new connection to the Kang Syndicate to leverage another loan. He hadn't just sold me to settle a debt. He was trying to sell me a second time, treating my position in Junseo's life as his new personal ATM. Junseo stepped out of the shadows then, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder. The touch was heavy and grounding, a stark contrast to my father's frantic greed. "He's been calling the associates, Emily," Junseo said, his voice a calm, lethal caress. "Telling them he has influence now, offering to trade information on your whereabouts for a seat at the tables." My father paled, his mouth working silently as the truth was laid bare. He had betrayed the very protection Junseo had placed over me. My belief in family, the fragile hope that I was loved by the man who raised me, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I looked at the stranger who shared my blood and felt nothing but a hollow, echoing silence. "Take him away," I whispered, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. As my father was dragged out, screaming about loyalty, I didn't watch him go. I turned instead toward the man who had stalked me, bought me, and caged me. In the wreckage of my old life, only one truth remained. The monster holding me was the only one who had ever truly intended to keep me. The drive back from the headquarters was supposed to be a silent transition between his world and ours, but the peace shattered with the screech of tires and the concussive roar of an explosion. Our lead car blossomed into a fireball of orange and black, the force of the blast rocking our sedan and sending glass spray across the interior. Before I could even scream, Junseo's hand was a vice on the back of my neck, forcing me down onto the leather seat, his body shielding mine as the rhythmic staccato of gunfire began to chew through the armored doors. In that moment, the silk of the velvet mask didn't just rip, it vanished. Junseo didn't call for backup. He became the backup. His movements were no longer the calculated gestures of a businessman, but the predatory strikes of a man born in violence. He moved with a terrifying, hyperprotective fluidity, his face a mask of cold, lethal focus. Through the shattered window, I saw the monster the world feared. He didn't hesitate. He didn't bargain. He systematically erased the threat with a ruthless efficiency that made my blood run cold, his eyes reflecting a darkness that suggested he would burn the entire city to the ground just to keep a single stray bullet from touching my skin. When the silence finally returned, heavy and smelling of spent gunpowder, Junseo didn't speak to his men or check his own wounds. He turned to me, his breathing shallow but controlled, his hands trembling with a restrained adrenaline that felt more dangerous than the gunmen. Back at the penthouse, the air was thick with the aftershocks of the velvet mask ripping. I sat on the edge of the marble bathtub, my knees shaking, a small scrape on my forearm from the flying glass stinging in the air. Junseo knelt before me, still dressed in his blood-spattered suit, but the lethality had been replaced by a devastating quiet reverence. He didn't call a doctor. Instead, he took a warm cloth and began to clean the scrape with such agonizing gentleness. It made me want to weep. His touch was a prayer, his eyes fixed on the small wound, as if it were a mortal blow to his own heart. The contrast was dizzying. The man who had just dismantled an assassination squad was now flinching at the sight of a drop of my blood. As he pressed a bandage to my skin, his thumb traced a slow, possessive line along my wrist, and I realized that while I was terrified of the monster he was to the world, I was becoming addicted to the safety of being the only thing he chose to be gentle with. The penthouse felt different after the ambush, thicker, as if the walls themselves had absorbed Junseo's lethal intent. While he was occupied with the fallout of the attack, a restless energy drew me toward the one door that always remained locked at the end of the north wing. I found it slightly ajar, a rare oversight in a world of perfect precision. Pushing it open, I expected an office or a vault. Instead, I stepped into the museum of my own life. It was a room of silence and shadows, lined with filing cabinets and digital screens that glowed with a ghostly light. My breath hitched as I pulled a folder from the nearest shelf. Inside was a photo of me at 15, sitting on a park bench I'd long forgotten, clutching a library book. There were more, hundreds of them. Photos of me walking to my high school graduation, blurry shots of me at my first job interview, even a receipt from a pharmacy for a prescription I'd bought 3 years ago when I had the flu. This was the archive, a meticulously catalogued history of every moment I thought I'd spent in solitude. There were records of my father's gambling losses, dated and timed to coincide with every miraculous extension he'd received on his debts. My stomach turned as I realized the random tragedies and sudden reliefs of my youth were merely entries in Junseo's ledger. "You were never supposed to see this yet," a voice said from the doorway. I whirled around to find Junseo leaning against the frame, his silhouette sharp and predatory. He didn't look guilty. He looked possessive, his dark eyes tracing the way I trembled under the weight of his secrets. "Why?" I whispered, gesturing to the walls of my stolen history. Was I just a long-term project? A game you were playing while I was starving? He stepped into the room, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow swallowing mine. He reached out, his hand cupping my jaw with that terrifying, reverent gentleness. "I didn't buy you to settle a debt, Emily," he confessed, his voice a low, jagged caress that vibrated in my very bones. "I created the debt. I broke your father. I bought your landlord. And I cleared your path for 4 years, just to ensure that when the time finally came, there would be nowhere else for you to turn." He tilted my head back, forcing me to see the absolute obsession in his gaze. "I didn't rescue you. I orchestrated the storm, so I could finally bring you home." The heavy revelation of the archive room hung between us, like a physical shroud, making the penthouse feel less like a home and more like a high-altitude vault. In the days following Junseo's confession, the silence in the halls became deafening. He had retreated into the cold machinery of his empire, giving me the space I had seemingly craved, yet the absence of his predatory warmth felt like a sudden drop in pressure. The opportunity for freedom arrived not through a daring rescue, but in a whispered encounter during a rare, supervised walk through the estate's private gardens. A woman I'd never seen, an elegant, sharp-eyed figure claiming to represent a rival faction, stepped out from behind the manicured hedges. She didn't offer a hand. She offered a key. "Junseo has built a world where you are the only son, Emily," she murmured, her voice a polished blade. "But even the sun is a prisoner to its orbit. We have a car waiting at the north perimeter. No debts, no shadows, no archive. You could go back to being the girl in the cafe. You could be invisible again." The word invisible snagged in my mind. For years, I had prayed to be seen by no one, believing that safety lived in the shadows of the mundane. I looked toward the north perimeter, imagining the cold rain of the streets, the hunger, and the constant gnawing fear of a father who viewed me as currency. Then, I looked up at the towering glass of the penthouse, where Junseo watched me from his office, a man who had dismantled my world, just to ensure he was the one holding the pieces. This was the Queen's gambit. To leave was to reclaim my autonomy, but it was also a return to a life where I had no value, where I was a victim of 1,000 small cruelties. To stay was to accept the silk and steel of a cage that, while terrifying, was the only place I had ever been cherished. I realized then that my old life hadn't been freedom. It had been a slow death by neglect. I turned back to the woman, my hand dropping the key into the dirt. "The girl in the cafe is dead," I said, my voice steadier than I ever thought possible. "And I think you're in my garden." The woman's expression shifted from pity to a wary respect as she vanished back into the trees. I didn't run for the perimeter. Instead, I walked back toward the mansion, my head held high for the first time. I wasn't choosing a prison. I was choosing the man who had made it impossible for me to ever be small again. The Grand Hyatt ballroom was a sea of predatory elegance, a gathering of the city's most dangerous secrets hidden behind tuxedos and champagne flutes. In the past, I would have been a ghost in such a room, a shadow leaning against a wall, praying to remain unnoticed. But tonight, as the heavy oak doors swung open, the air itself seemed to bow. I walked at Junseo's side, my hand resting lightly on his forearm. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight silk that clung to my skin like a second identity, its weight a reminder of the silk and steel world I had chosen to inhabit. For the first time in my 19 years, I did not look at the floor. My chin was high, my gaze steady, as it swept over the men who had once terrified me, men who now went silent as we passed, their eyes reflecting a new, wary respect. Junseo moved with his usual cold precision, but there was a subtle change in his aura. He wasn't just the head of the syndicate tonight. He was a king presenting his queen. His hand moved from my side to the small of my back, a proprietary touch that sent a familiar jolt of electricity through me. He didn't need to speak to claim me. The way he positioned his body, always shielding, always watchful, told the room everything they needed to know. I was the one thing in his empire that was truly untouchable. As we reached the center of the room, Junseo paused, leaning down to whisper against my ear, his breath a warm contrast to the icy stares of his rivals. "Do you see them, Emily?" he murmured, his voice a low, possessive caress. "They no longer see a girl from a cafe. They see the woman who owns the man, who owns this city." I looked at him, truly looked at him, and didn't see the monster who had bought my life, or the stalker who had archived my youth. I saw the only person who had ever looked at me and seen something worth the effort of obsession. I leaned into him, accepting the weight of the crown he had placed upon me, no longer a victim of a debt, but a partner in a dynasty. The girl who apologized for existing was gone, buried under layers of midnight silk, and the dark devotion of the man who had waited years to hear me say his name. Tonight, the invisible cage hadn't just opened. It had become my throne,